ஆரம்பிச்சிடலாங்க ஐயா.
ஆரம்பிச்சலாமா? சரிம்மா. இப்போ வணக்கம். ஏர்லி இந்தியன்ஸ் என்ற புத்தகத்தின் 3வது வாரம் இது. பேராசிரியர் ராஜ் முத்தரசன் அவர்கள் முதல் நாகரிகம் ஹாரப்பா என்ற 3வது அத்தியாயத்தை பற்றி பேச இருக்கிறார். அவரை முறையாக அறிமுகப்படுத்த முன்னாடி அவரை பற்றி ஒன்று சொல்லணும். வட அமெரிக்க தமிழ்ச்சங்க பேரவை, தமிழ்ச்சங்கங்களுடைய கூட்டமைப்பு 1988ஆம் ஆண்டு துவக்கப்பட்டது. அந்த அமைப்பினுடைய முதல் தலைவர் அவர் என்ற பெருமைக்கு உரியவர். அவரை முறையா அறிமுகப்படுத்த நம்ம சுபஸ்ரீ என்று இந்த அமெரிக்க மண்ணில் பிறந்து வளர்ந்த ஒரு பெண் அவர் வருகிறார். அவரை பற்றி ஒன்று சொல்லணும். அவர் மேரிலாந்து மாகாணத்தில் உள்ள ஃப்ரெடரிக் தமிழ் பள்ளியில அமெரிக்க தமிழ் கல்விக் கழக பாடத்திட்டங்கள் புத்தகங்களை படித்து அவர் இருமொழி முத்திரை சீல் ஆஃப் பைலிட்டரி சீல் ஆஃப் அப்ரூவல் அதை பெற்றிருக்கிறாரு. மிக பாராட்டுக்குரியது. அதுக்கும் இல்லாம இங்க வாஷிங்டன் வட்டார தமிழ் சங்கத்துல நிர்வாக குழுல இடம்பெற்றிருக்கிறார். இந்த மண்ணில் பிறந்து வளர்ந்து நிர்வாக குழுல இடம்பெறுவது தனிச்சிறப்பு வாய்ந்தது. கணித்துறை கம்ப்யூட்டர் சயின்ஸ் பேச்சுலர்ஸ் டிகிரியை 2 ஆண்டுகள்ல முடிச்சு இப்பொழுது மாஸ்டர்ஸ் டிகிரி படித்துக்கிட்டு இருக்காரு. அவர் தமிழில் சிறந்து விளங்குவதற்கு அவருடைய பெற்றோர்கள் முக்கியமா காரணம். சுசீந்திரன், சூர்யா அவர் பெற்றோர்களை ரொம்ப பாராட்டுறேன். இப்பொழுது பாருங்கள், சுபஸ்ரீ பேராசிரியர் ராஜ் முத்தரசன் அவர்களை அறிமுகப்படுத்தி பேச அழைக்குமாறு கேட்டுக்கொள்கிறேன்.
நன்றிங்க ஐயா. அன்புள்ள அவையோரே, ஒரு சிறந்த ஆய்வாளரும் வேதி பொறியியல் கெமிக்கல் இன்ஜினியரிங் மற்றும் உயர் வேதி பொறியியல் பயோகெமிக்கல் இன்ஜினியரிங் பேராசிரியர் முனைவர் ராஜ் முத்தரசன் அவர்களை உங்களுக்கு முறையாக அறிமுகப்படுத்துவது பெரும் மகிழ்ச்சி அடைகிறேன். பேரா முத்தரசன் வேதி பொறியியல் துறையில் சென்னை இந்திய தொழில்நுட்ப கழகத்தில் இளநிலை பட்டத்தையும் அமெரிக்காவின் டிரெக்ஸல் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தில் 1973 முனைவர் பட்டத்தையும் பெற்றவர். அவர் வழிகாட்டலில் 30 மாணவர்கள் முனைவர் பட்ட ஆய்வையும் 40 மாணவர்கள் முதுநிலை பட்ட ஆய்வையும் மேற்கொண்டு தம் துறையை குறிப்பிடத்தக்க அளவில் மேம்படுத்தினார்கள். அவரது ஆய்வுகள் பதப்படுத்தல் கட்டுப்பாடு ப்ராசஸ் கண்ட்ரோல், உயிர்வேதி பொறியியல், மாழை பதப்படுத்தல் ப்ராசஸ் மெட்டலர்ஜி மற்றும் அண்மையில் உயிரி உணரி பயோசென்சர்ஸ் போன்ற துறைகளில் NSF, NIH மற்றும் USDA போன்ற மதிப்புமிக்க ஆய்வு நல்கை கழகங்களின் உதவியுடன் மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்டன. உயிரி உணரிகள் தொடர்பான அவரது முன்னோடி ஆய்வுகள் 12 உரிமங்களுக்கு வழிவகுத்தன. அவற்றுள் மரபணுவுக்கான நெடுங்கை உரியுணரி, cantilever biosensor for DNA, புற்றுநோய் உயிரி சுட்டிகள் கேன்சர் பயோமார்க்கர்ஸ் மற்றும் நோய் காரணிகள் பேத்தோஜன்ஸ் கண்டறிதல் போன்றவை முதன்மையானவை. இவற்றிலும் குறிப்பிடத்தக்கது சில 100 புற்றுநோய் உயிரி சுட்டி மூலக்கூறுகளை அளவிடுவதற்கான வழிமுறை. பேராசிரியர் முத்தரசன் AICHE, AAAS மற்றும் AIMBE ஆகிய அமைப்புகளில் உயர்நிலை உறுப்பினர் ஆவார். மேலும் பல குறிப்பிடத்தக்க ஆய்வேடுகளின் ஆசிரியர் குழுக்களில் பணியாற்றியுள்ளார். அவரது படைப்புகள் அவருக்கு டிரெக்ஸல் பல்கலைக்கழகத்தின் ஆராய்ச்சி விருது, மாட்சி சேவை விருது போன்ற பட்டங்களுடன் பிராங்க் A. ஃபிளெச்சர் பேராசிரியர் இருக்கை உள்ளிட்ட குறிப்பிடத்தக்க பெருமைகளை பெற்று தந்துள்ளன. கல்விசார் பணிகளுக்கும் மேலாக அவர் டிரெக்ஸல் பல்கலையின் பொறியியற் கல்லூரியின் இடைக்கால புலத்தலைவராகவும் வாஷிங்டன் கொலம்பியா மாவட்டமில் உள்ள தேசிய அறிவியல் நிறுவனத்தில் NSF வாஷிங்டன் DC திட்ட இயக்குநராகவும் பணியாற்றியுள்ளார். சென்னை இந்திய தொழில்நுட்ப கழகம் அவருக்கு தகைசால் முன்னாள் மாணவர் விருது வழங்கி பாராட்டியது. மேலும் ALCOA, ஷேரிங் பிளவு, பயோகெம் டெக்னாலஜி, ஸ்மித் கிளைன் மற்றும் ஐநாவின் மேம்பாட்டு திட்டம் UNDP போன்ற அமைப்புகளில் வல்லுநராக தன் சிறப்பு திறனை வழங்கியுள்ளார். இத்தகைய பெருமைகளையுடைய பேராசிரியர் ராஜ் முத்தரசன் அவர்களை இன்றைய தலைப்பான முதல் நகரமாந்தர் அரப்பா மக்கள், the first urbanites, the Harappans என்பதை பற்றி பேச அழைக்கிறோம். வாருங்கள் ஐயா.
ரொம்ப நன்றிமா சுபஸ்ரீ, ரொம்ப அழகா பேசுனீங்க. எத்தனை தடவை ப்ராக்டிஸ் பண்ணீங்க? ஆன்சர் பண்ணாத, டோன்ட் ஆன்சர். I'm just kidding. Couple of my friends are also attending. அவங்களுக்கு வந்து தமிழ் டைரக்டா தெரியாது, பேச்சு தமிழ் தான் தெரியும். அதனால I'm going to speak in English, but இடையில இடையில தமிழ்ல I might speak. ஓகே, அது ஓகேங்களா அரசு?
ஓகேங்க, தாராளம்.
ஓகே. இதுதான் என்னை பொறுத்தவரையில் ஃபர்ஸ்ட் புக் ரிவ்யூன்னு சொல்லுவாங்கல்ல, அந்த இதுதான். திஸ் இஸ் ஃபர்ஸ்ட் டைம் ஐம் டாக்கிங் அபவுட் இட். ஃபர்ஸ்ட் டைம் என்னுடைய சப்ஜெக்ட் ஏரியா இல்லாத ஹாபி ஏரியாவில் பேசுறது இந்த வென்யூவில் தான் ஒரு 3 மாதத்துக்கு முன்னாடி. ஸோ திஸ் இஸ் அனதர் எக்ஸ்பீரியன்ஸ், இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங் எக்ஸ்பீரியன்ஸ். Now, the part that I'm going to talk about is chapter 3 of Tony Joseph's book. We had money that discussed the first farmers last week, and Bama presented the first Indians. And I may point out, first Indians was 48 pages, farmers were 38, mine is 62 pages. So my load is 50% more than Mani's. And of course, next week it'll be Arasu, who will also be same 62 pages. Maybe the 2 senior people in the group are assigned the most number of pages. Anyway, that aside, the chapter 1 really dealt with hunters-gatherers of India, if you will, the phase of people who were hunter-gatherers, they were not farmers, that led to, as an evolution takes place, to farming and herding, taking care of animals, getting resources from nutrients from animals, and of course farming so that you could generate grains. And of course, when you're able to do a lot of good quality farming, you have free time, and therefore you can do other things that leads to, as many of this farming occurs, it grows into urban settlements. And of course, urban settlements with excess of productivity, you can then deal with trade, and social organization is needed. And of course, art becomes part of the culture. Literature becomes part of the culture. Storytelling, maybe epics and things like that evolve as time progresses. But of course, in the phase, chapter 1, you're completely consumed with gathering food, just sustaining yourself. Second one, you're trying to create food. In third, you're creating a society, a civilization, if you will. And so that is what my talk is about, my chapter 3 is about. Oh, I got to figure out how this shortcut works. Okay. Now, this section, chapter 3, contains 11 subsections in total, but it can be divided up into 3 main components, if you will. The first component are the features of urbanization in the Indus Valley, or Harappan civilization, as Tony Joseph prefers to call, and that is approximately half of the whole topic, if you will. Then he devotes 3 sections to languages of Harappan, and of course, we'll get into that. It's a very interesting topic, an area in which I'm very interested in. And then finally, pieces that have been, one is how these people moved south, and the relationship of how some of them emerged in India, emerged in Tamil Nadu, and of course in Karnataka, in Maharashtra and Gujarat, etc. And he provides linguistic evidences using Southward's work. So that route to south is really about the fact that authenticating that movement of people from Indus region to South India. And then I think the author didn't know where to put Austro-Asiatic language speakers, how they came into, so he just tagged on these people at the end of this chapter. There's no connection to Harappan's urbanites, but these folks came from the eastern end via Assam and then into Bengal region and then into mainland India. And they constitute a small part of India. So he's tagged on this section 10 because I think he didn't have any other place to put that section. It's an important section because there are theories how they contributed to Indus and other rice cultivation especially. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. Okay, that is sort of the outline of what today's section is. This is an outline which Mani had last time. I just put this in so that we have a context in terms of time. 300,000 years ago was the first human was found in Morocco. By the way, it was discovered in the 1960s. At that time, it was cataloged as Homo erectus, not human, Homo sapiens. But in 2017, it was re-examined by scholars and found it was really humans. It had human features, and so it got cataloged into humans. So one may think they are half human and half pre-hominins, if you will. But then the one that is in Israel, which is 180,000 years ago, was another important part. Generally, this part Obama described very nicely about using climate change argument as to why the folks from Africa moved out and why that particular time, 70,000 years, actually is sort of set in stone at the moment, is when the first out of Africa migrants come into Middle East and then back into India. 60,000 years ago is when they really meet archaic humans who had already come into India hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they create a generation of people. And as Mani described, I'm just jumping across, the farmers came into the Indian region approximately 6, 7, 8,000 years ago. And then going forward, the agricultural settlement, small villages, began sprouting up after Mehrgarh around Indus region, and I have a map to show you later. And then they coalesce into cities later, around 1900, 2600 BCE. And of course, you have interaction of those folks. Those folks abandon the Indus Valley sites and move away. Some of them stay behind. There's DNA evidence to suggest that some of them stayed behind in Rajasthan, but many moved south and perhaps eastward as well. There's good evidence for the southward movement, and I'll describe that again. Around 2100 BCE or a little bit later, you have over 1,000-year period during which folks from steppe pastoralists, they were not city dwellers, they sort of managed animals, herds, and they rode horses and came into India via Hindu Kush that was established by 2019 paper. And they brought with them Indo-European languages. The reason why Indo-European languages exist in the northern India is because the number of people who came via that route was not small. It was a huge number. And of course, that has that implication in the language change. And then the final part, Tony Joseph includes is 2000 BCE, folks who speak Austro-Asiatic language who bring in a variety of rice into the Gangetic Plain. There's some evidence to support this. And they bring in another class of languages. These languages are more closely related to Vietnamese and Cambodian languages of 2,000 years ago. And they exist now in the middle of India, if you will. So this is a piece that he doesn't talk about Tibeto-Burman language because they didn't move in, but it was already present in the foothills of Himalayas. But these are the sections that Tony Joseph covers in his book, if you will. Now, I know when I was listening to Obama's talk and also later on, I was a little confused. So I included this for clarity. The term Paleolithic is used frequently by archaeologists. And Paleolithic simply means Old Stone Age. And it is divided up by scholars into 3 domains: Lower Paleolithic, that is 2.5 million years ago, to up to 300,000. Don't ask me how they came up with the 300,000, but that's what the scholars have agreed upon. And that is based on the kind of tools that they were using. And then the Middle Paleolithic, Middle Stone Age, 300,000 to 50,000 years ago. And they were using more advanced stone tools, and they were Neanderthals. And then Upper Paleolithic is 50,000 up to 10,000, which now butts against Homo sapien time period. They use more complex tools. They created art on walls, etc. And they begin to organize farming and etc., that type of stuff. So these 3 terms are important. Just keep in mind, the way I remember it is middle is always something like 300 to 50,000. Lower is really a higher number. and upper is really lower number in terms of time period. Now, India is rich with Paleolithic sites. And of course, a very well-known one, which is recognized by United Nations as World Heritage Site, is Bhimbetka, a site in Madhya Pradesh, and of course, Athrimbakam in Tamil Nadu. Both of them are very, very ancient. They have unique properties that even it was discovered even as late as a few years ago. The Athrimbakam sites where the Homo erectus who were living there, people who stood up on their feet, not crawling on four legs, pre-hominins. They were not humans, they're not Homo sapiens, but they were related to us DNA-wise, something like about 97%, but they were of a different species. We do not know whether they spoke. We don't have any genetic residues of them, but we know they existed by the tools they used. And of course, that goes back over 1 million years old. And the Bhimbetka has got all three phases, lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic artifacts. And these two are very important sites for India. There are many others. I've just listed 6 of them. To give a context for the Harappan, now I'm turning to the main topic of today. The main place we'll be talking about are Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and of course further down in India, Dholavira and Lothal, and of course other sections in Punjab. If I were to take this triangular route, the perimeter of this triangle is about 1,000 miles, if I remember right. And so the closest one to Mehrgarh, which was the topic of discussion Mani took up last week, the first farm settlement, if you will, is only a few hundred miles from Mohenjo-daro. And of course, there are a map that I'm going to show you, which was due to another author, where there are many, many farming communities that were around Mehrgarh and that impinges against the region where Mohenjo-daro is located. The green region that you see here is really the alluvial area where it is fertile. The dark brown area is really not as fertile, but you'll notice that there are small rivers that are adjacent to this farm settlement, Mehrgarh. And so they'll have to figure out some way of bringing water in. They might have harvested rainwater. And they relied actually on, according to scholars, they relied on monsoon weather for their plantation. The reason why they did wheat and barley was because of when they got their rain, if you will. Now, the key point is right on top, which says mud brick homes of Mehrgarh becomes cities by approximately 5000 BCE, but more like closer to 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE, which is considered the peak period of Harappan civilization. There were many, many sites. I'll have a slide on that. And there are archaeological evidences that show this evolution from a village of mud brick homes to this brick town was a continuous process. It evolved. There are sites that contain information, archaeological artifacts that tell us how these structures evolved. And we may not be able to get into all the detail, but I'll at least highlight some of the things. Okay. The urban settlement is a natural development of agriculture. That is what the premise of anthropologists is. That agriculture productivity is a precursor to urban development. Excess production, that is, if you're able to cultivate a certain amount of area, you may end up, if your cultivation method is effective, you'll produce a lot more than what you would consume, and therefore that the excess becomes tradable, and therefore that gives you free time during non-growing season, and therefore you're engaged in other activities, and that leads to what the scholars call as a civilization, so settlement and city landscape, if you will. And there's a formal definition of civilization given on page 117, which is etymologically derived to city. It's 100 times larger than a village, and it has full-time specialists, craftsmen, merchants, officials, ruling class, large public buildings, artists, sculptors, painters, seal engravers in the context of Indus, writers, and record keepers. The first city of the world is Uruk, Lower Mesopotamia, capital city of Gilgamesh. 3200 BCE. At that time, Harappan civilization was still developing. It was still emerging from a farming to a city-state, but they were not yet a city-state. So it gives you a context as to where Mesopotamia was with respect to where Harappans were. Now, the major IVC urban centers, this is only a partial list. There are about 7 of them. I have highlighted important ones. One of the largest ones is Mohenjo-daro, and of course now Rakhigarhi is competing with that as to be a much larger one, which is on the Indian side. And Harappa Dolavira, where Bama actually visited, she gave us a nice talk about it. Lothal, a port city of the Indus folks. Kalibangan in Rajasthan, and of course residue of plowed fields, etc. And the characteristic of these towns I'll describe in another slide. This is simply a visual picture to indicate how Mohenjo-daro looks like. And of course, what you see all the way up here is a stupa that is of a much later vintage. But what you see here are the houses, if you will. And the Great Bath is located right at one end of the building. And this is another view of the city. And of course, these seals have been found, and some have given various attributes for these sculptures. I'll go into that a little bit. Okay, this is a picture from the researcher Mukhopadhyay from one of her papers. The picture that is in the text in the book is a little gray and not as clear, and so I chose to use this colorful one. The important one that for you to focus on are the green triangles. Those are the little farming villages that propped up between 8,000 BCE and about 5 or 4,000 BCE. These were pre-Harappan villages, if you will. They all contain, these are all based on archaeological evidence. They all had mud brick thatched homes with little farms adjacent to that. The evidences of herds, small animals, if you will, and so on and so forth. So the circular brown ones, like for example this or this, are actual cities, meaning they were structures with common infrastructure and the like. There were many of them, and of course I listed on the previous slide just 7 or 8 of them. There are lots of them. Many of them were very tiny. Some of them were very large, and one of the largest ones are the Rakhigarhi and Mohenjo-daro, one on either side of the border, if you will. Now, the other important thing I want to point out is the dotted line that is noted here is the so-called dead river, Gagar Hakra River. And of course, that flows pretty much parallel to the Indus River Indus River. But it apparently shifted at some point. There are some various theories as to when it changed directions, etc. This is not uncommon, by the way. Rivers change directions. This is a well-known fact in the field. And so there are sites, little towns that were on the banks of these rivers. And of course, the later river lines also had those cities as well. So something to keep at the back of your mind. By the way, if any of you are interested in these slides, glad to make them available to you so that you can dig further into them. The key points made by the author in these slides are: one is 8,000 to 3,000 BC, that time frame, Mehrgarh area, which is in Balochistan. 2, Indus Valley, the growth really took place from villages to growing towards small towns and then to large towns. And there are archaeological evidences that show continuity of this evolution. That's an important point to remember. Second one is archaeological evidence indicates continuous evolution. Not all the cities had walls surrounding them. Some had. At the peak, it included current-day Pakistan, East Afghanistan, Northwest India. There are almost contemporaries of Mesopotamian civilization. So the peak period of Harappan was 2600 BCE. The peak period of Mesopotamia was 3200 BC. So they're about 600 years apart, not terribly far apart. The residents were, in these cities, first Indians, chapter 1. Bama described them very beautifully. And they were actually blended with the first Indians who came into India 60,000 years ago with the agricultures that came from Zagros mountain region, the folks that Mani described last week. So it's a combination of those folks. They apparently got along fine together and created the city civilization. So they were the founders of Harappan civilization, if you will, the first Indians and the Zagros mountain farmers, if you will. And they had trade contact with Mesopotamians. Evidence presented by Tony Joseph includes seals, inscriptions, hairstyle, clothing. I'm going to show some of this. As similarity, by the way, water buffalo was domesticated in the Indus region. They were not native to other places. And the fact that they were exported, there are evidences in Mesopotamian literature that they imported buffaloes. And the buffaloes have this broad horn that curls up. And of course, here it is shown as a Mesopotamian, maybe healers doing something with two buffaloes on either side. It's a cylindrical seal, by the way. And so the fact that this existed suggests that there was a movement of buffalo from Indus region to Mesopotamia. Now, excavation has yielded water buffalo residues at Mehrgarh. So at Mehrgarh, they had domesticated water buffalo. Water buffalo would have been wild, by the way, but prior to 8000 BC. So they're domesticated, presumably for their milk, for their nutrients. And of course, they had residues of wild pig. Maybe they hunted them. And gazelle, probably that was a hunted material. And there are similar type of material that have been excavated. Mehrgarh was a very important site, by the way. It has been very deeply studied, and so there are a number of publications about that particular site, by the way. Now, here is another one where another cylindrical seal of where the gentleman on the left is holding on to a lion, on the right-hand side holding on to or fighting a water buffalo from Indus region. And I think the key thing, the way it is described in the literature is, by the way, these slides are, or rather these pictures are in the book, but they're of black and white, not of high quality. So I was able to get them from the websites of the museums. I think this particular one is at Louvre in France. And so I had reasonably good quality images that I was able to download. And the important thing, the buffalo that I want to point out, there's a side story that's in the pink on the left-hand side, is mozzarella di buffalo is a delicacy that evolved in Italy a little over 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And those buffalo, the reason why they chose buffalo for the cheese was because buffalo is higher in fat content and therefore a higher cheese content. Casein is the protein that contributes to making of cheese. And that's about twice as much as it's as a cow milk. And so the volumetric output of buffalo milk for cheese making is greater. And of course, but if you buy mozzarella in the US, it's a cow milk, it is not buffalo. You have to go to Europe to get it. But specialty stores in the US, like the one that I'm thinking about is, it's just around the corner. The specialty grocery stores in the US will carry buffalo milk-derived mozzarella. It has a different flavor if you have ever tasted them compared to the one that you buy in a regular grocery store. Consider that when the next time you're in a grocery store. And of course, in India, paneer, ricotta cheese also is derived from buffalo. It's an Italian cheese. And if you had been to Egypt, you will get Domiati cheese that is also derived from buffalo. So buffalo from Indus region populated Egypt, Italy, and of course, Mesopotamia. Now, here is another similarity Tony Joseph describes, because the left-hand side is an Indus seal where the gentleman is holding on to or fighting two lions simultaneously. On the right is actually an Egyptian ivory blade of a sword, the handle of where the inscription, where the artwork on it is a Mesopotamian man holding or fighting two lions. The description given by scholars is, in ancient times, fighting very wild animals is a sign of power and authority. And so the Mesopotamians used lions, while the Indus folks or the Harappans used the lions, which is more native to India. And Tony Joseph says these are similar kind of thinking of people of ancient times. And if you're reading this in Tony Joseph's book, he lists this as 2750 BCE, but this piece is in Lower where they listed as 3300 to 3200 BC. So there are some small time differences. Okay. There's some confusion here. Okay. Now, the other part that Tony Joseph makes is there are similar hairstyles. On the left-hand side of the Indus Valley folks, he calls them as people having two buns. So the top part of the hair is tied up into one bun here, and the bottom part of it is tied up into another bun, and of course it's broken. The front face looks like this. And here is another one. This one is in Delhi Museum, by the way. If you ever go take a picture on the side, I took only the frontal picture. And from the back of it, you could see there appears to be two buns. And of course, Tony Joseph makes a special description of how the hairstyles were similar for men. And he includes this particular panel from Mesopotamia, pointing out this particular bun behind this gentleman, the leader of this warrior faction. And of course, there is another person here with double bun. But when this panel is from 2450 BCE from Mesopotamia. But when I looked at up close, which is the bottom person, it is literally a headgear that there's sort of a helmet-like thing with a band that ties some bundle, not hair. And even the one that's on top, it looks like a bundle of something, not hair. So maybe it has been misread, and I'm not sure whether that would be something to look into. A question we should ask Tony Joseph. Why did he interpret this as a double bun when it is really a sort of a bundle of clothing that is tied at the back? Nevertheless, he calls them as similar. The other similarity that he describes is the upper cloth is worn over the left shoulder, and he points out to this so-called priest-king entity with a shoulder on the left shoulder. The clothing goes over, and of course here is one from his from the picture that he includes in the book, where the clothing goes over the left shoulder of this individual. And here is one from another Mesopotamian ruler, don't I remember his name. And of course, he wears his clothing that goes up, and of course, he gathers it on the front like Buddha statue has, and it's collected together, and he's holding in sort of a pensive mood. So he argues the manner in which they dressed in Indus may have been influenced by the way folks were dressed in Mesopotamia. Now, what are the differences? There are no temples or palaces have been found at IVC sites in the Harappan civilization, but cultures that were in contact, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Elamite, did have large ziggurats, which are their term for temples. Thus far, 32 ziggurats have been excavated in Mesopotamia, 28 in Iraq, 4 in Iran. I've listed here 3 examples. I'm not going to describe them because these are very highly ornate and they're well described in the literature. Beautiful pictures you could look at on the website. And the another important difference is there were no special funeral monuments such as those found in Egypt, Mesopotamia have been found at IVC. So the burial system were quite simple. They were not very elaborate. And so this is another difference that the author points out. The other point that he makes is there were no wars in Harappan civilization, and he presents this particular seal to say that there's a woman in the middle, and there are 2 men on either side holding spears, and of course there are mythological figure on the right-hand side. This is a cylindrical seal found at Kalibagan, and of course people have interpreted as a love quarrel, or it's a human sacrifice. We really do not know what it is. But the important thing that Tony Joseph makes is, and also Kenoyer makes this in his papers, During 700 years of Harappan, there's no evidence of war has been found. War weapons were absent in Harappan cities, but hunting weapons were excavated, largely peaceful society among several hundred settlements who traded with each other and traded overseas. They seem to have been a very congenial community, not like the way things are now. The other features of IBC urban sites are there were extensive public infrastructure, included well-designed water harvesting and drainage systems. Cities were well planned, and streets were intersecting in a grid pattern, pretty much like the modern cities of today. And there were over 700 wells. Water was an important resource, and the Great Bath and Mohenjo-daro. And they were very well aware of water conservation. Many houses or groups of houses had separate bathing areas and toilets. Drains from such areas sloped towards the street to sewage drain lines. Recent excavation showed commodes were made of big pots sunk into the floor, and these pots had tiny holes at the bottom, presumably for stuff to seep out into the ground, into the earth. Dr. Singh notes there were lotas were found at the bottom of internal latrines. So it was a very well organized, pretty much like the way that you might see a latrine in a village in Tamil Nadu today. And they used standard weights, uniform weights, not right through the time period. There was a period when they used this. And they had made jewelries of semi-precious stones, carnelian, agate, lapis lazuli, turquoise, jasper, steatite. There were terracotta jewelry too, gold, silver, copper, bronze, and thousands of bangles. Kenoe makes the remark that if I call his Egyptian colleague, how many bangles did they excavate in Egypt? They'll say a few dozen. But of course, in Indus, you find hundreds of thousands. So bangles was very much a Harappan civilization thing. And I'm not sure whether we'll find a woman in India who's not wearing a bangle. And so the bangle was an important part of the culture, it appears to be. And here is a picture from the website of the Harappan.com website, jewelry that have been discovered. It has gold jewelry as well as terracotta. I won't dwell on this. And the top one are the ones that people would wear around their forehead, men generally. And that practice, by the way, is still present in Tamil Nadu. Some of you may recall. That's one of the first things you do when a person gets to a wedding. He gets, if you will, blessed with a golden adorning his forehead. Anyway, bangles were bangles in plenty amount, and of course the shell bangles were plenty that was discovered in Gujarat. And of course, there were terracotta bangles too. Interestingly, my recent visit into Bihar and Bengal area just a month ago, they were still selling shell bangles at temple outs. I don't know whether they're available in Tamil Nadu, but shell bangles are still popular in village areas in India now. The picture down below, which is on page 115 of the book, is from the author's presentation. It looked like gold to me, so I dug into it. It turns out it is made out of a clay, type of a clay, which has been fired, which has this kind of a color. It is not fully cured, according to Kenoyer. It has got some parts which is a little raw, and this was excavated at, don't remember which particular one it is. Kenoyer comments was bangles found at IVCs multiple times more at IVC than at all ancient cities combined. So you can think about Indus Valley as a bangle civilization, if you will. Now, IVC timeline from farmers to city dwellers. This is outlined on page 120 of that book. Early food production era, 7000 BC, Mehrgarh time to 5500 BCE. Then regionalization, this is what is called early Harappan period, 5500 BCE to 2600 BCE. This is when multiple villages and settlements grew around that area, east of Mehrgarh, closer to the Indus Valley, Indus River. And then mature Harappan is 2600 to 1900 BC, and then late Harappan is 1900 to 1300 BC. By the time the folks from steppes have penetrated into this area. And there are many settlements that are listed. These are all authenticated using archaeological methods and that are on the left-hand side. I won't go into them. Although they had different pottery style, there were some similarities. Some of them were fortified, not all of them. Some had fortification. I wanted to find out when the fortifications were built. Were they built after the arrival of the steppes or before? I couldn't dig up that information, something to look into. And then the second important observation Tony Joseph makes is some of the mature sites had no early Harappans level, meaning they all began settlements around 2600 BCE. But there were others that had early settlement and there was an intermediate, something like a fire that destroyed things, and then there was a rebuild. So there was two phases of early and the mature phase in the same location. So they were of various different varieties, if you will, at that site. Tony Joseph devotes a whole section to the Uruk city example. The reason is Uruk is the first city. Liverani has written a whole book on this. And that progress was because of irrigation, according to the author, and high farm productivity that led to, in their civilization, to temple building. And temples became a central part of their culture, very different from Harappan civilization. The temple gave rise to growth of chieftains and kingdoms and empires. He attributes the canal irrigation in combination with animal tracking, plowing, load transport to growth, and that took place very rapidly. And he attributes, that is the author Leverani attributes, the irrigation to be a very important and a significant contribution there that led to a very rapid growth and growth of those cities, if you will, namely the Uruk, the city of Uruk. And the most important feature that I wanted to distinguish when you compare with IVC is the differences literature. They had a rich literature, and I was really impressed by this. I remember reading about it a long time ago. I decided to dig into this, and I'm going to share a little bit of this. Two things that I want to highlight: debate poems. They were literally poems that were written 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, that you can now read and appreciate. And the other was the literary output of a epic, Gilgamesh epic. If any of you are in Philadelphia area, if you go to Penn Museum, Gilgamesh's face of that period is really present in that museum, something you might consider taking a look at if you're in Philadelphia area. Now, the Mesopotamian Debate Museum is a very unique literary output. We don't have anything like that in the Indian context. Maybe there are, some of you may be more aware of this. They belong to approximately 2600 to 1800 BCE. And these are debates between non-humans, between sheep and a grain, bird and a fish, pickaxe and a plow, silver and copper. And I'm going to illustrate just one example, sheep and a grain. So here sheep makes a point and then the grain responds. Here grain's argument against the sheep is, I'm going to read it. O sheep, you are but a creature of open field, roaming without a house or storehouse. You do not stand in the temple, nor do you fill baskets of great shrines. Enki, that is their main god, if you will, has given me the power to nourish people and bring prosperity to the land. So it describes its strength and literally looks down upon the sheep as a lower being, if you will. And the sheep responds in a different way. O grain, though you may fill the storehouses, what would people wear if not for my wool? So it says, without my wool, you're going to be shivering in the winter. What offerings would you make to gods without my milk and lambs? Because they would sacrifice lamb to gods. So without a lamb, you cannot satisfy Enki. Enki has blessed me too for the warmth and sustenance I bring. So this is poetics is just fascinating. And I've looked at some of the others. It's really worthwhile looking at this and seeing whether there are any similarities in any Indian literature that corresponds to these kinds of poetics, if you will. And I think that's rather unique literature. Now, Gilgamesh is an epic which It's thought to have been originally concocted around 2100 BC during Akkadian period, early Akkadian period. It was lost. It was rewritten around 1200 BCE in the newer version of cuneiform. And of course, the formal versions of that is available. Good bit of it is available. There are a few pieces that has been missing. So Gilgamesh was an emperor, king, the king of Uruk, the town, the major town of that time period, the only town according to scholars of that kind at that time. He embarks on quests of deep friendship with a wild man, Enkidu. When I've seen pictures of Enkidu, he looks like a monster, battling monsters, namely evil forces, fighting evil forces to keep humanity together, ultimately seeking immortality after Enkidu's death. The poem explores themes of mortality, whether a person can live forever, that type of a thought process, very advanced thinking, friendship, kingship, and the limits of human ambition, and of course, or rather, life after death and things of that nature. Whether a person can become a god and things of that nature. Those kinds of pretty high-end thinking is embedded in that particular epic. The best preserved version was discovered from the Ashurbanipal library, which belonged to 7th century BCE. It's not 100%, it's a good 85 to 90%, but it is in a later cuneiform. So the original cuneiform, we have lost a little bit of that original form, but we have a later form of it, which seemed to have some references to the biblical Noah's Ark. So remember that Moses' time was 1200 BCE. So this, what was written, reconstructed in 7th century BC was about 500 years after the time period of Moses or Ramses II, who was the ruler of Egypt at that time. So there are some connectivity to Egypt too here. Oops. All right. Now, languages of Harappan. Now I'm moving on to the next section. One script, we suspect it is one script, but many languages because similarity of the seals that we find. Current IVC region, the area that we see, it's close to, I believe, something close to 1 million square kilometers. There are now 7-8 languages are spoken, thus very likely in ancient times there were many languages. They probably used the same single script, that is a guesswork. Many scholars indicate language to be Proto-Dravidian. Genetic evidence is used by author to indicate Dravidian. I'll describe what that is. So the genetic evidence Tony Joseph describes, which actually comes from other people's work, which David Wright's work, is Indus periphery outliers. There are two people in the Indus periphery. These are two little towns that are in Turkmenistan and Iran. Their genome is not the same as the remaining skeletons that were found. And those two guys, those two people had 14 and 42% of the first Indian folks. These are the folks who live currently in Andaman. Remember the one that Dr. Thangaraj was pivotal in bringing to the open literature. So the fact that these outliers outside of Indus area had this amount, 14 and 42%, suggests by genetic gradient argument, people in Indus had the similar kind of characteristic, namely they were a combination of the Indus or rather Zagronian farmers and the Andamanese folks, if you will. The outliers were interpreted as Harappan folks, so they served as a genetic proxy for IVC population. This paper, by the way, came out around maybe 15 years ago, but of course we have more newer pieces of data from 2019 publication. So this is an important point on page 134. Archaeological evidence comes to the same conclusion as ancient DNA evidence. There is a strong connection between Zagrosian and the people of Harappan civilization region dating back to the period when agriculture was only beginning in Mehrgarh. So the thought process when Tony Joseph constructed this argument was the Indus folks got their farming technology via Mehrgarh, who were early populators from Zagros Mountains. And of course, 2019 Shinde paper argues the opposite. This is a slide from one of my earlier one, because that paper in 2019 says the Rocky Gargi skeleton was really a combination of Andamanese, a proxy for first Indian, and hunter-gatherers from Iran, not farmers from Iran. And of course, it's only one sample. There are other speculations. I don't want to delve too much into this particular topic because that'll be an endless, because there are no good answers. The other part is the important part that I wanted to get into. I'm 40 minutes into my talk. I'll finish it in about 7-8 minutes, hopefully. McAlpin's Southward premise and hypothesis. Brahui is linguistically close to Elamite. It is an assertion that is stated by previous authors that Tony Joseph makes. And the argument made by Southward is, and also McAlpin, is herders from southern and central Zagros region, speakers of Proto-Elamite and related languages, migrated to South Asia sometime after 7000 BCE, mixed with first Indians, and this mixed population sparked agricultural revolution and created Harappan civilization. And he provides an argument out of the data for why that is, linguistic arguments. The other second important point is some Zagronian migrants to South Asia may have remained herders, namely take care of animals, not farmers, to this day, like the Brahui speakers of Balochistan. Apparently, Brahui speakers primarily are cattle managers. They're not farmers, apparently, according to what I read. Then he goes into a big description of words that are common in Elamite and Proto-Dravidian, etc. And there's a big argument made by Southward and, of course, McAlpin, who are both linguists. I won't get into a great deal of details, except I'll just point out one or two, since I'm running out of time. Before I get into that, Professor Southward in Linguistic Archaeology of South Asia, that's a book that he wrote a few years ago at the end of his career. The sharing of words of sesame between Mesopotamia, Akkadian Ellu, and South Dravidian Ellu reinforces the hypothesis of the presence of Dravidian speakers in prehistoric Indus Valley. So he connects this one word with Akkadian to Indus Valley to South Dravidian, if you will. Ancient DNA and genetic studies indicate steppe pastoralists reached India only in the late Harappan period, that is after 1900 BCE, bringing with them an early version of Sanskrit and ritual sacrifices. Newly arrived Indo-European speakers call themselves as Aryans because that's documented in Rig Veda. What this means is Harappan civilization had nothing to do with Aryans or Sanskrit or Vedas and was pre-Aryan or pre-Vedic. And that's a direct quote from his book, by the way. And I think that's an important point that I think we need to emphasize. There are all kinds of stories behind it. Now, deciphering Indus script, he primarily relies on Asko Parpola's and Ayurveda Mahadevan's arguments. And these are well documented, by the way. Ayurveda Parpola has written a book on it, and Mahadevan has written several illuminating articles about this in Hindu, and which is in popular media that you can download and read. And I think the point that is made here is the Vedic society was pastoral and rural, and Mahadevan, both of them argue that these were pre-Vedic. And of course, they didn't have any genetic data, but they argue based on the cultural elements of what they observe. Tiger is often displayed in Indus seals, no tiger in Rig Veda. Worship of buffalo-horned male god, mother goddess, people tree, and serpent and possibly phallic symbol, not from Vedas, but from pre-Vedic culture. And interestingly, this still continues to current times. Both Mahadevan and Parpala suggest seals bear proper names and names of persons and astronomy symbols. They're not really languages. They seem to argue in that way, not for all, but most of them. And I found this little snippet that I've highlighted sort of difficult to swallow. Tony Joseph stated that Chola, Chera, and Pandi were brothers who lived together in ancient times. Chola, the advisor, Chera, the high officials, and Pandi, the commoner. I have no idea where he got that idea from, but nevertheless, it's in his book. Harappan's route to south, this is an important part of it. that dominant language of Harappan was Proto-Dravidian, that's sort of established. Authors suggest it may have reached South India around 2800 BCE, but it doesn't provide any evidence. This is something worth exploring. We need to ask him this question on 29th. First migrants to the south may not have been urbanites, but pastoralists. The argument made by this is based on linguistic analysis. Southward's toponym analysis indicate Harappans took a coastal route to South India. Balakrishnan's voluminous, detailed toponymic analysis of the broader IBC sites indicate connectivity to South India. So Southward makes the argument Palli is village in Proto-Dravidian. Southward makes a strong argument as to how linguists peel off from current current words to proto-version using certain well-accepted methodologies linguists use. And so Palli is a Proto-Dravidian word meaning village. And of course, in Maharashtra, there are many places called Valli and Olli, and village names. There are over 800 of them, and most of them are near the coast. And Southward argues the folks from Indus took a coastal route towards South India. By early first millennium, this is an interesting observation, extensive areas of Gujarat, coastal Maharashtra, and southern Maharashtra were occupied by a population that used a Dravidian language for daily interaction, either as a primary home language or a lingua franca. I remember listening to Southward's seminar some 25 years ago. He used the term, I'm now paraphrasing, Marathi has a Dravidian foundation as a term that he used at that time. Now, some words. I don't want to deal too much with this. The argument made by the Southward and McAlpin is many of the words that are found in Proto-Dravidian and Proto-Elamite words, there are 80 of them they have tracked down, and he lists the book lists 10 of them. I've just listed 5 on this, there's another 5 on the other. Many of them are related to herding, namely taking care of animals. And therefore, the argument is made that people who moved from Indus to South India initially were herders. They were not farmers. They were not city dwellers. The urbanites may have come later, is the argument. I'll just take one example. The second one, puttu. In Elamite, it is P-U-T-U. Puttu means lamb in that language. Proto-Dravidian is put or plant, or Tamil is puttu meaning sapling. Interpretation, Tamil puttu is used for sapling, which aligns with the idea of youth and growth, etc. Small animal is also related to that. So knee is another one that looks almost identical phonetically. I want to move on. Another set of 5. The one that I was interested in is to die. In Elamite, it is sa, is single syllable, sa. In Tamil, of course, savu, sagardu. And of course, Malayalam, it's the same word. And there are many similar words between Elamite, and there are 80 words they have identified, the two authors. And I've just listed 10 of them, and those are the 10s that are in the book. And this is the leftover piece that Tony Joseph wants to address, which is the Austro-Asiatic language. And of course, this is a map of India with Indo-Aryan being spoken by 78% of the people, Dravidian 19%, Austro-Asiatic 1%, Tibeto-Burman 1%. They were not migrant Tibeto-Burman, they were natives there. And so, but the Austro-Asiatics were people who came from the east. And the argument that I made is there are two classes of Austro-Asiatic languages, Munda and Kashi. And of course, they are spoken at different sections of India. And the important part that the author makes here is the rice cultivation. And he makes the rice cultivation. He simply quotes an existing literature of Lahura Deva rice being dated as 7000 BC. That is the time period of almost Mehrgarh, which of course has been debated by many scholars, and I've quoted at the bottom a scholar's view that this is not believable. And now Reich writes in his book, rice and millet entered peninsular India 3000 BCE from China, and that is a direct quote from Bellwood's work on domestication of rice, which apparently took place in China and the folks from China who expanded due to extraordinary agricultural output flew in southward into Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and of course some of them came into India, and they belong to haplogroup O2A, and they are present in plenty in the northeast, by the way. But their mitochondrial DNA is Indian, M haplogroup. And I think if you remember last time that the one of them was really in Mesopotamia. So they are really the results of migrants from Southeast Asia who brought rice cultivation, according to some scholars, into Gangetic Valley, and with mitochondrial, with maternal heritage being totally Indian. I think that is my last slide. I'll stop there and answer questions or discussion. It took 50 minutes, sorry, 45 minutes to 50 minutes.
Very good talk. Please, everybody clap your hands. And Professor Mutharasan, it's a difficult task, 62 pages, and he prepared good slides and presented. We have another 25 minutes for question and answer. Please raise your virtual hand and be brief. If you are brief, many questions can be asked. I have a question, Professor Raj. From Indus Valley இருந்து கப்பல் இதுக்கெல்லாம் மெசபடோமியா போனதெல்லாம் கடல் வழியா தான் அதிகமா போயிருக்கிற மாதிரி தெரியுது. பட் இது சிந்து சமவெளி நாகரிகம் பறந்து பட்டு இருக்கு. ஒரு இடத்துக்கு இன்னொரு இடத்துக்கும் டிரான்ஸ்போர்டேஷன் எப்படி இருந்துதா? ஏன்னா அந்த முத்திரைகள்லாம் ஒரே மாதிரி இருக்கு. அந்த சீல்ஸ் எல்லாம் பார்க்கும்போது ரொம்ப காமனாலிட்டி இருக்க மாதிரி இருக்கு. டிரான்ஸ்போர்டேஷன் சி பேரர்ஸா இருந்தது, லேண்ட்லயும் ஏதாவது இண்டிகேஷன் இருக்கா?
Well, the evidence that we have, apparently, I think this is presented in maybe Tony Joseph's book, is they use bullock carts, looks like it. And Kaide was an important, donkey was an important load barrier. But they had, the distinction that I remember reading about is their wheels were not spoked. They were sort of solid wheels or something like that. And the spoked wheels came later. So they might have come by, bullock carts would be the way that I think. But that is not particularly addressed in the book, the transport. But in the Mesopotamian literature, we know that ships unloading buffalo, that reference is there. So they did go by ship. And of course, Lothal was a port city, and it had a shipyard. And so there were other means by which they've done. I don't know whether there were other port cities that I have not looked into. I wonder, Bama, have you looked into this?
No, yeah. Actually, Lothal is predominantly their port city. That's what I remember. But apart from that, is there anything else? Is not.
Mostly it is by land, and I think
But there is another result between like the inland communication, right?
Yeah.
Between Lothal and Dolavera, they had water route as well. Along with land route, they had water route as well. So, that is there, but predominant with the Mesopotamians or the other Elamites, their communication was through the coastal route. That Markan route was the predominant one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Subha Karakudi, கேளுங்க.
செஷன்ஸ் ரொம்ப நல்லா இருந்தது, வெரி இன்ஃபர்மேட்டிவ். தேங்க்யூ ஸோ மச். 2 கொஷின்ஸ். ஒன்று இந்த காட் பற்றி பேசும்போது பஃபலோ பற்றி சொன்னீங்க, மதர் காடை சொன்னீங்க. வேறு ஏதாவது காட் இருந்தாங்களா அதில் ஸ்பெசிஃபிக்காக மென், உமன் அந்த மாதிரியான காடு? 2வது கொஷின், உமன் எம்பவர்மெண்ட் அந்த காலத்தில் எப்படி இருந்தது, உமனுடைய லைஃப் அப்படிங்கிறதுக்கு ஏதாவது ஆதாரங்கள் இருக்கா? நன்றி.
I'm now quoting what Balaya has said, that among the small figurines found, 70% of them were women, and the most number of small votive statues were women. And the thought process is, Mother Goddess was the thought process that people have speculated. Since we don't have a written literature, right? That suppose there was a little piece of Indus script that said God. The idea of temple did not appear to have existed, or temple was not given a big high preference. But there are speculations from looking at Indus seals that they prayed to trees. Trees were considered holy, and now that is an interpretation. Remember, now, and of course, the presence of people being the so-called, people called it as Pasupati seal. It is not, and the Pasupati didn't exist at that time. The idea of that deity having a buffalo horn as being a deity is because of animals were considered more powerful than men. Buffalo, the Sumerian cylindrical seal trying to tame a buffalo suggests, or taming a lion, or taming a tiger. These are indications of ancient people thinking about serpents and such wild animals as more powerful than them, and therefore they thought about them as something more than humans, perhaps something between a deity and something else, some intermediate concept. So the scholars say there are no large temples. There might have been worship, and there's been one statue that looks like a lingam, but we do not know. That has been interpreted by some folks as a lingam, but if you asked a certain scholar who's never looked at a lingam, he would say it's simply a stone that looks vertical, right? So these kinds of, without documentation, it's very difficult to interpret what kind of faith or what kind of beliefs they had at that time.
டாக்டர் சுவாமி வாங்க கேளுங்க.
ரொம்ப நன்றிங்க. இது சிறப்பாக இருந்துச்சு முத்தரசன் சார். இதில் எனக்கு ஒரு சின்ன ஒரு கேள்வி. நான் அதுக்கு முன்னாடி முதல்ல உங்களை பற்றி ப்ரீஃப் பண்ணுங்கன்னு சொன்னதுனால, என்னோட சுவாமிநாதன் மிஷிகன்லேருந்து பேசுகிறேன். இப்போ இந்த சிந்திச்ச மொழி நாகரிக மக்கள், அதாவது வடக்கிருந்து இப்போ தமிழகத்துக்கு இடம்பெயர்றாங்க. இதே மாதிரி அவங்க கடல் வழியா மேற்கு ஐரோப்பாவுக்கு போயிருக்கா, அந்த மாதிரி ஏதாவது இருக்கா? நான் எதுக்காக அதை கேட்குறேன்னா, முத்தரசன் உங்களுக்கு தெரிஞ்சிருக்கும், நான் சமீப காலமாக நிறைய வார்த்தைகளில் வந்து மேற்கு ஜெர்மானிய மொழிகளில் உள்ள, அதாவது ஜெர்மானிய மொழிகள், அந்த செல்டிக் அப்படிங்கிறதுல பார்த்தீங்கன்னா, அது கிரேக்க மொழியும் கிடையாது, லத்தீனும் கிடையாது. ஆனால் அதோட மூலச்சொற்கள் நிறைய பார்த்தீங்கன்னா புரோட்டோ திராவிடியனுக்கான சொற்களோட இணைவாக இருக்கு. இப்போ அந்த மாதிரி ஏதாவது குறிப்பிட்டிருக்காங்களா? இந்த மாதிரி அவங்க கடல் வழியா குஜராத் பக்கத்துல இந்த பக்கத்து இடம்பெயர்ந்த மக்கள் ஐரோப்பா கடல் வழியாக போன மாதிரி ஏதாவது தகவல்கள் ஏதாவது இருக்கா? ஏதாவது ஆதாரங்கள் இருக்கா?
We have evidence that they went to Mesopotamia. Thus far, I have not seen any data that suggests that they went farther than that. No DNA evidence that have been so far come to the fore. So that is what we know, because there were ancient DNA found in Mesopotamia that related to folks from Indus as well as from Tamil Nadu and Assam, if I remember right, but not beyond that.
Thank you. Uma Pannirselvam.
நீ பேசுறது கேட்கலவுமா?
கேக்குதுமா?
கேக்குதுங்களா ஐயா? ஐயா, எனக்கு ஒரே ஒரு கேள்விதான். நீங்க அந்த எருமை ஏற்றுமதி பத்தி சொன்னீங்க. இங்கேருந்து மெசபடோமியால வந்து எப்படி நம்ம இங்கேருந்து அதை ஏற்றுமதி பண்ணணும்னு. அதை பற்றின குறிப்புகள், அதாவது தரவுகள் வேற எங்கேயாவது இருக்கா? நமக்கு கிடைச்சிருக்கா? இந்தியாவிலேருந்து தான் இந்த வாட்டர் பஃபலோஸ் வந்து ட்ரேட் பண்ணாங்க அப்படிங்கிறதுக்கான ஆதாரம் வேற எங்கேயாவது இருக்கா? நீங்கள் சொன்னீங்க இல்லையா, மெசபடோமியாவில் ஏதோ இருக்கு அப்படின்னு சொன்னீங்க. அந்த மாதிரி வேற நாடுகளுக்கு நம்ம ஊர்லேருந்து இந்த எருமை ஏற்றுமதி செய்தார்கள் அப்படிங்கிறதுக்கான தரவு ஏதாவது இருக்கா அப்படிங்கிறது முதல் கேள்வி. இன்னொரு கேள்வி வந்து, இந்தியாவுக்குள்ள குதிரையை வந்து நிறைய முன்னிலைப்படுத்தி பேசுகிறாங்க. குதிரைகள் எப்போ இந்தியாவுக்கு வந்தது அப்படிங்கிறத பத்தி ஏதாவது தரவுகள் இருந்தாலும் சொல்லுங்க ஐயா.
The ஏற்றுமதி வந்து there have been residues found in Egypt area which belong to a much later period, something like about Common Era, 0 CE in Egypt, which had a Tamari inscription on a pot, I think, on a pottery shed has been discovered. And of course, in 10th, 11th century in southern China, there are inscriptions that seem to suggest, but not of this antiquity of the peak period of 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE, which is a 700-year period of mature phase of Harappa. But the Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia and in Elam. Elam is the southeastern in Iran, right? That is where Elamites were, Elamite speakers. But there is an inscription in Mesopotamia that tells of stuff coming from Meluha, which is a word that Sumerians used to describe people who lived in Indus Valley. So although we don't have inscriptions from India that says that they went to Mesopotamia, but we have Mesopotamian inscriptions that say that material came from Indus Valley. The other part that I wanted to point out, if any of you are in Philadelphia, they have a collection from a burial site of a queen from Mesopotamia. I think the name is Pubi or something like that. I forget the name. Enormous number of jewelry, and many of them are attributed to have come from Indus Valley, and many of them are lapis and some of the semi-precious stones. So there was a good exchange of trade, and in fact, I believe Tony Joseph or David Reich writes about sesame being cultivated in the Euphrates Valley based on the rain, or based on the cultivation method that was used in elsewhere, meaning Meluha, I think. I'm not sure. So there were some exchanges that took place, and of course, why they did not have elsewhere. If you were to go back to the mature phase, which is 2000 BCE or 2500 BCE, who were the people who were civilized? I mean, settled cities were present. They were present in China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Indus, nowhere else. That's it. There were no other cities at that time period. They were herders, they were nomads, and they were running around hunting and gathering. And so they couldn't have traded with nomads, right? They could have traded only with cities and towns. I don't know whether there was any connection with China, but and of course the Chinese connection comes much later during 8th, 6th, 7th century because of the expansion of the Silk Road and the movement of the Buddhist thought process. That's a much later time period.
Thank you.
நன்றிங்க ஐயா.
சொல்லுங்க.
அந்த குதிரைகளை பத்தியும் ஐயா, அது வந்து நமக்குள்ளதா, நம்ம நாட்டுக்கு எப்போ வந்தது அப்படிங்கிறதும் ஒரு கேள்வி இருக்குங்க ஐயா. When did
I haven't read directly about it, but my understanding is that it came with the people who came from the steppes around 1900 BCE. They brought the horse with them.
அதற்கு முன்னாடி நமக்கு வந்து கிடையாது இல்லைங்களா? அத வந்து
ஆனா கழுதை இருக்கு போல இருக்கு.
கழுதை இருக்கு. குதிரை வந்து இப்ப முன்னிறுத்தி நிறைய சொல்றாங்களே, அதனால தான் அந்த கேள்வி கேட்டேன் நானு. Horses, were there horses before that steppy people who stepped in, or how is that? அதுதான் என்னுடைய கேள்வி.
That's correct. And if my reading is correct, we also didn't have spoked wheels. I believe we had solid wheels. That's what my reading is. That's something I should check. And so the spoked wheels came with the step people. And because those of you who are mechanical engineers would immediately recognize it as a better moment of inertia because the weight is outside, and therefore once you Once you initiate it, it'll go for a longer period than a solid wheel would. So there are advantages for travel with a spoked wheel compared to a solid wheel.
நன்றி ஐயா.
சுந்தரச்சோழன் கேளுங்க.
வணக்கம். எனக்கு வந்து 2 கேள்விகள் இருக்கு. ஒண்ணு வந்து இந்த ஐ திங்க் உங்களுடைய செகண்ட் ஸ்லைட்ல நினைக்கிறேன் டைம் லைன் பத்தி சொல்லிட்டு இருந்தீங்க. அதுல வந்து யூ ஆர் மென்ஷனிங் அபவுட் பிஎம்ஏசி அண்ட் இஃப் மை மெமரி இஸ் ரைட் யூ மென்ஷன் தட் த ஸ்டெப்பி பாஸ்டலிஸ்ட் ஸ்டார்டட் த பிஎம்ஏசி அண்ட் ரீச் தி ஐவிசி அப்படின்னு சொன்ன மாதிரி எனக்கு ஒரு நினைவு. அதுல வந்து லுக் அட் மோஸ்ட்லி பைபாஸ் இட் அப்படின்னு கரெக்ட். அதுல வந்து அஸ்கோ பர்பலா சொல்லக்கூடியது கொஞ்சம் டிஃப்ரெண்டா இருக்கு. வாட் ஈ சேஸ் இஸ் தி ஸ்டெப்பி பாஸ்டலிஸ்ட் இன்ஃபேக்ட் எஸ்டாப்ளிஷ் தெம்செல்ஃப் இன் பிஎம்ஏசி. அவங்க இந்த ரூலர்ஸாவே கூட அவங்க அங்க இருந்தாங்க பிஃபோர் தே மூவிங் ஆன் டு ஐவிசின்ற மாதிரி அவர் சொல்றாரு. அதை பத்தி ஐ வுட் லைக் டு ஹேவ் யுவர் வியூஸ். அதுல ரெண்டாவது வந்து என்ன கேட்டீங்கன்னா ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் பத்தி பார்க்க போகும்போது இதுக்கு ஏதாவது இருக்கா? லைக் இப்போ பிஎம்எஸ்சி வந்து நான் இண்டோ யூரோப்பியன்றது தான் அவருடைய வியூ. அப்போ நமக்கு இங்க ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் வரும்போது ஸ்டெப்பி பாஸ்டலிஸ்ட் தனியா அந்த பிஎம்எஸ்சின்றதுக்கு தனியான ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் நமக்கு எதுவும் கிடைச்சிருக்கா? இது வந்து ஒரு கேள்வி. ரெண்டாவது என்னுடைய கேள்வி என்னன்னு சொன்னா நீங்க இந்த லாங்குவேஜஸ் பத்தின ஹரப்பன் லாங்குவேஜஸ் பத்தின ஸ்லைடு போடும்போது அதுல வந்து ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் பத்தி நீங்க சொல்லியிருந்தீங்க. அதுல இண்டஸ் பெரிய பெரிய அவுட்லையர்ஸ்ன்றதுல வந்து சஹரி சொக்தாவை நீங்க ரெஃபர் பண்ணீங்க. எனி ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் ஃப்ரம் சிப்ரி ஆர் பிராக் ஏரியாஸ் ஐ வுட் லைக் டு நோ, பிகாஸ் அந்த ஏரியாஸ்ல வந்து ஃபர்ஸ்ட் எவிடன்ஸ் ஆஃப் ஹார்ஸ் அண்ட் அதர் திங்ஸ் எல்லாம் அங்க கிடைக்குதுன்றதுனால ஐ வுட் லைக் நோ வெதர் எனி ஜெனட்டிக் எவிடன்ஸ் ஃப்ரம் சிப்ரி ஆர் பிராக். தேங்க்யூ.
Okay, first question is easy. The thought that that the incoming steppe people did not stay in BMAC is because of the data that came out of ancient genomic data in 2017. And so this is David Reichs concludes, since only trace amounts of steppe people genomes are present in BMAC, they did not stay. They simply went through that area. They did not stay there. They came directly into the Indus region. So that argument is based on genetic data, ancient genomic data. But previously, I don't remember how what the argument Parpala made that they actually stayed at BMAC, but that is what the current evidence is. By the way, I should also point out, as I'm there, prior to the 2019 paper, which Shinde is the first author, and also David Reich, much of the genomic analysis was done at David Reich's lab. Narasimhan is also the second author on that paper. That prior to that, the thought process was they came into Iran via the Iranian plateau into Indus. They pointed out that they did not come through that route, but instead they came through BMAC into Hindu Kush into Indus Valley. That distinction really emerged only using ancient genomic data. But people didn't, from steppe people did get into Iranian plateau. That was a little bit later. And of course, I think I discussed this in one of my postings here. I won't get into that. Your second question is really related to this, correct?
Because very much, because we are talking about genetic evidence,
Right.
and also the path of migration. The earliest evidences archaeologically we are getting in Sibri and Perak, like as I said, the horse remains and other things which are related to the steppe pastoralists. So I would like to know that there is any genetic evidence gathered from areas like Sibri or Perak. You are mentioning about Sagari Sokta. Are there any evidence from these two areas is what I would like to know.
Well, I haven't looked at that, but I don't think it is covered in this book, nor have I run into it in David Reich's paper. The two that were important were for the Indus folks, apparently, according to the authors, are the Indus periphery, or Indus Klein is what it's called, and BMAC. BMAC to establish the arrival of steppe people, when, etc. And the Indus periphery for the genetic composition of Harappan people. So these are the two important components. The others, where they had horse, etc., I'll have to read about it. I do not know.
Okay, thank
Thank
you very
you.
much for the clarification. Thank you.
Jagadishan, கேளுங்க. That's a final question.
சார் என் பேர் ஸ்ரீதரன். நான் வந்து நியூஜெர்சிலேருந்து பேசுகிறேன். எனக்கு வந்து ஃபர்ஸ்ட் இந்த சீஸு மில்க் எல்லாம் பற்றி சொல்லிட்டு இருந்தீங்களா?
கொஞ்சம் சத்தமா பேசுறீங்களா?
அந்த சீஸ் அண்ட் மில்க் பற்றி சொல்லிட்டு இருந்தீங்களா
ரைட்.
ஒரு ஸ்லைடில். நான் வேற ஒரு இடத்துல படித்தது வந்து என்ன சொன்னாங்கன்னா, இந்த மாதிரி ஐவிசி பீப்புள் ஹேட் இன்டாலரன்ஸ் டு மில்க்.
That is correct. Typically Dravidian, the milk tolerance, tolerance of lactose came with the folks, with steppe people, because they were herders. They were exposed to milk much earlier than the folks in the Indus Valley. On the other hand, remember that the part that a person is intolerant to is lactose. Lactose is a disaccharide. This is two sugar moieties connected by an alpha-1,4 bond. And once you hydrolyze it, there's no lactose intolerance. And so you can hydrolyze it by fermenting it, or you could do some other acidification. Like if you put a little bit of lime juice into milk, it'll curdle up cheese. That cheese will not have lactose, and you'll be able to consume it as a nutrient without any intolerance to the milk. The important concept is lactose intolerance. That is the two, lactose is disaccharide. As I said, there are two C6 molecules. It's connected by a bond, and people who are intolerant do not have the capability to hydrolyze that particular bond, and therefore they become intolerant. It passes through without metabolism, and then the bugs in your intestines consume it and produce a copious amount of gas, and you bloat up and become extremely uncomfortable. And so once it's hydrolyzed ex situ, namely out in a vessel, you can consume it.
Yeah, I came to know that IVC people, they were intolerant, so they moved to curd.
No, you could be lactose intolerant, but you will not be intolerant to curd.
No, that's what they switched from milk to curd. அப்படின்னு படிச்சேன்.
Yeah, that's what they would have done. That'll be my guess.
Okay. The other question I had from Tony Joseph's book was, he mentioned about the first cotton migration, first cotton cultivation in the entire world, some about 8,000 years from now, and they found a trace in the vase, in one of the vases.
I think that is the point Mani made last time, I think, at Mergarg.
Mergarg, yes.
Right, at Mergarg. That's
Okay.
a question for Mani, I think.
If you can.
Sure. I wasn't entirely convinced with that argument. Basically they found some copper ornament and traces of cotton string in that. They didn't have any evidence of actual cotton being present. It's just a string-like image on it. So I think it probably needs more investigation. But if that is true, yes, he's right. It's the first instance of anybody growing cotton anywhere in the world.
My reading suggests that I recall reading some time ago that cotton was domesticated in Indus Valley.
Yeah.
And it was exported because cotton was highly sought after. And then the same cotton gave rise to what is known as Egyptian cotton, which apparently was a longer staple and a superior cotton, and that literally overtook the market or something like that. But something to look into. But I think there's some data on where cotton was domesticated. There's some literature on that, other than in this particular book.
Well,
Thank
we
you.
have, we have come to the conclusion of today's excellent talk. I request Mr. Mani Manivannan to say a word of thanks and offer some concluding remarks.
Certainly. It's a great pleasure to offer a word of thanks. It's a wonderful presentation, Professor Raj. Applause. There are some questions that only a chemical engineering professor could have answered, and I think that was amazing. The presentation was brilliant. You in addition to what is on the book, you also went and looked at other supporting data that made it really fascinating, and I'm sure that the audience really appreciated it. And we look forward to the conclusion of the review next week, when Dr. Arasachalaya is going to be talking about the last migrants, as Tony Joseph puts it. Why are they last migrants, and what happened to all the people who came after the Aryans? So that should be an interesting presentation. I think he is also planning to cover, in addition to that chapter, the epilogue, which is just as long. So please join us next week at the same time. And a week after that will be when we get to interact with the author of the book. So, reserve your toughest questions for the author. So thank you again for joining us and asking very wonderful questions and staying until the end of the meeting so patiently. Vanakkam.
Thank you. Thank you.
நன்றி ஐயா.
நன்றிங்க.
நன்றிங்க ஐயா.